Today we're going to be painting a street scene, focusing on how to paint it in a loose manner that captures the atmosphere of this location. This video is a follow-on of one I did a little while ago where I talked about linear perspective and how to draw this scene. We use lines to create the feeling of depth. Today we're going to be looking at aerial perspective, which is a technique that helps us add depth to our painting by concentrating on the effects of the atmosphere. So aerial perspective, or atmospheric perspective as it's also known, basically means as objects move further away from the foreground, they become lighter, they become softer, they become bluer, and they become a little bit duller. So we will use these techniques as well as wet on wet and dry brush strokes and really every tool that we have at our disposal to create a painting that captures the atmosphere of this location without having to paint every tiny little detail. So let's begin. All right, we'll let that sit there for a bit. Now let's look at the colours we need to mix. If we have a look at our reference, you can see that because of the time of the day, a lot of the colours are quite muted, so there's very few really bright colours there. So we don't have to worry too much about being very accurate with our colour mixing. When I paint a subject like this, I'm just trying to capture the feeling of the location. I don't try and include every little tiny detail that's there. What we can see, we've got a warm sky, there's a bit of blue, so the sun is in somewhere in this area here, and you can tell that's the case because there's the shadow. The shadow is away from the sun, so if you see the shadow at the bottom of this car, you know that the sun or the sunlight is coming from somewhere up here. And then as you move further away from the sunlight, the colours in the sky get a bit more blue, unless it's an overcast day, of course. And if we look at the road, we can see how, even though it's a black road surface, it's quite a bit lighter and warmer in the distance than it is in the foreground. So we'll include that as well. So I'll start by mixing my sky colours and the road. So this initial wash is to paint in the lightest tones of the scene. So for the sky, I'll have some Cobalt Blue. It's a bit too strong. And with skies, generally, it's better to go too light rather than too dark. That's good. Leave that there. And now I need some clean cad orange. So I'll just clean the top of this. And it looks quite strong there, but when you test on a piece of paper, and it's very important to test on a piece of paper, you can see how really just how weak a mixture it is, and it will dry even weaker than that. So that will do for the sky. I like to mix my road colour because I like to see my colours separate on the paper. So for the road, usually I use some French Ultramarine, a little bit of burnt Sienna, and a small amount of permanent rose. Oops, small amount, Joe, way too much. But that's okay because I haven't actually hit the tone I want. So I'll now add a lot more of the French Ultramarine and a lot more of the burnt Sienna. It's a bit too warm still, so I'm going to add some Cobalt Blue to it. So Cobalt Blue is a very neutral blue. French Ultramarine is a red leaning blue, so sometimes when I'm mixing a colour like this and I've added too much, say permanent rose, I'll use some Cobalt Blue to cool it down. Bit too violet. The cat orange I added there cancels out a little bit of that blue colour because orange is the complement of blue. May have gone a bit too far. And that's just right. When I'm painting, I spend quite a bit of time getting my initial colours worked out, both for colour and tone, and that's why it's important that you test the colours on a scrap piece of watercolour paper. And I find by doing that, I can then paint very quickly. So we'll go back to our paper. I'll wet it again. I'll paint down to the tops of these cars, or the edge of the road surface really. Paint to there. And then we'll pick up the Cobalt Blue. And then over here we'll go in with the Cobalt Blue. We'll just use it to cool down some of these darker areas. And it'll be a bit cooler underneath the awning here. And I'll tint the back of these cars as well. But I want to leave the windscreen relatively untouched. And I like leaving the top of the boot reasonably untouched as well, and that'll give us a light area later when we start painting the cars. Okay, so now I'll pick up my road colour, give it a little bit of a swirl because the paints will have settled. I'm going to take out about half the paint. Now what you can see is happening here, and I did this totally on purpose. I made sure there was plenty of this sky warm colour sitting at the edge of the road, and that's now flowing down and automatically lightening this mixture. And that just helps add to that aerial perspective that I was talking about at the start. And then as I move further down with the stronger paint, the tone just automatically gets stronger. A bit too light. This path needs some colour on it. Now, when I'm looking at this, I think this is still too dark up here, so I'm going to get some of this dirty cat orange. You'll notice when I cleaned the top of this cat orange before I put the dirty paint into here, so whenever I need some dirty cat orange, I just pick it up from there. There we go. And then we'll run that in and just let that flow down. And that's just doing two things. One, it's warming up the road, but it's also lightening it a little bit as well. Underneath here, that would be darker as well, but not as dark as this area here, because again, as things move further away, the aerial perspective lightens these darker tones. So we'll just drop some diluted road colour really. All right, so this still has lots and lots of shine on it. I need to let it dry a little bit naturally, and then I'm going to lift some of the details on the road. Now, using a size 12 brush, cleaning all the paint out, squeezing it into quite a sharp shape, and I can use that to draw in some of the, or hint at some of the tram lines on the road. Main thing to remember is these tram lines have to be in the direction of the vanishing point. And you're not going to see all of them. This is a very busy and wide street. Because it's so wide, the tram lines are actually quite a distance away from the viewer. The viewer, in our case, is right here. And if we look at the road surface, we can see how it's not just a pristine, flat surface. Even a good road will have indents in it, areas of discoloration and that, different materials. So this would be asphalt, whereas over here is probably concrete around the tram lines. So I'll pick up some of this paint and add some more paint to it. I want to just create a thicker mix. So if you pick up this paint, put it into a dry part of your palette and add more paint to it, you have to increase its tone by doing that, because we're not adding any more water, we're just adding more paint. So let's throw in a few lines. Maybe dilute that a bit, but take most of the water out. Okay, what I'd like to do while this area is still wet is put some colour into the windows, and you really can't see much colour. For the windows, I just make them up. In the finished painting, you won't see very much detail here. So I'll pick up maybe some of this orange. These are doorways and they're quite dark, so for that I'll just use some French Ultramarine and burnt sienna. Just quick brush strokes. Leaving the odd little bit of white there as a bit of glitter. We'll grab some Scarlet Lake, throw some of that in as well. some cad yellow, put some colour on this barrier here. All right, while that's sitting there, let's look at mixing some colours. We're going to start on the left-hand side of our painting and work our way across. Because I'm right-handed, it's safe to do it this way because I won't accidentally smudge any of the paint. If you're left-handed, it might make more sense to start on this side and work across the painting this way. As I said, the scene is very dull and grey looking, so I'm just going to mix some greys. And I already have a good starting point with this grey here that I used for the road, and I can use that for some of my other greys. Got some blue. I'm going to add some cad orange, maybe the dirty cad orange, a bit more cobalt blue. Some burnt sienna. My first aim is to mix the right colour, then I take a moment to get the consistency right. And that's a good colour there. Under the awnings, really there's not very much colour there at all. I've got this road colour. I'm going to add some French ultramarine into that. That's pretty good. And I'll make sure I work in some other colours there. Then here, remember I said the scene is primarily grey, so I just mixed whatever was in my brush from here in with all these other colours. And because this area represents some of each of the primary colours, I know I'm going to get a grey. But the greys in the distance are much bluer, so I'm going to add some cobalt blue, add more water. And that's okay for the distant area. Okay, so this has lost most of its shine. So now I'm going to dry the surface because for me to get some of my broken edges and sharp edges, I need to be painting on a dry surface now. So now the top layer is dry, but there's still plenty of moisture in the paper, so the paper is still sitting quite flat. There's no cockling at this stage. So we'll start up here. And I try to paint with as much as I can with a size 12 brush for this detail work because the bigger brush stops me from getting too bogged down in detail. Yeah, it's a bit too dark, but what I'll do first, I'm going to use some of this thicker paint. Actually, it's not thick enough, so let's pick up some of this paint over here. More burnt sienna and French ultramarine. Maybe some cobalt blue. Oops. Just a little bit of the cat orange. And I'm just trying to add some shapes here. I don't want this to be a dead flat shape. And I'll lift out some of the paint, because this wall is getting a lot of reflected light and direct light from the sky, so it's a bit too strong in tone. And you can see how I just drag this bead of paint down and then stop, obviously, when I get to a sharp edge. And I'm always varying the colour, warming it, cooling it, create just some interest in the shapes. I don't like flat shapes that are too regular. And then as we move into the distance, there'll be less and less detail. All right, now we'll work under the awning. Actually, we'll work on the awning first. Just pick up some dirty orange. We'll let that sit there. And I'm just sneaking in some warmer colours to help bring this part of the painting into the foreground. Here, grab some permanent rose and French ultramarine to create a violet. Remember, we're not going to see a lot of light there, but I'll leave just a hint of light showing here and there. Dilute it a bit and do the same here. The awning, because of its shape, it's getting a lot of light on it, so it's actually got to be quite a bit lighter than that. So I'm just lifting some of that colour. And we'll come back and add some detail later. Okay, now we've got this colour here. I'm just going to drag some of that paint around. So I'm basically using the same colours that I used for the road for this part. Going to be a lot darker. Right, we'll let that sit there for a bit. And we'll continue with these other buildings. And remember, I had this weak mix of blue-grey colour. Might just get the size 8 for some of these smaller distant shapes. Even here, I'll vary the colour a little bit and really add some more blue. Now I've just realised I've left out the key building, which is the Richmond Town Hall. That, just get some raw umber. It's quite a light coloured building, or it was when I took the photo. That'll do. Okay, now we've got foliage here, so I need to quickly mix some greens for that. I'll mix my brightest green, which is, I use Aureolin or Winsor Lemon. And I've got this sort of bright green. If I want to dull it, I can just pick up some of this road colour. Maybe a bit of orange. I quite often, when I have lots of windows like this, I just very quickly paint around them. Okay, so now I'll get some quite thick paint, French Ultramarine and burnt sienna. But I don't have a lot of the paint in my brush. Go back to my fan brush. I don't want this tree to be quite so bright because it is still fairly diffused light we have here. The reason I keep picking up too much permanent rose, managed to drop some water in there, so all the permanent rose very wet. A little bit of permanent rose goes a long way. All right, pick up some more dark colour. Vary the colour. Just had a bit too much water in my brush when I did that. Great. So this should be dry enough now for me to just put some decoration on that awning. Okay, so this is still a little bit damp. Probably need to hit that with a hairdryer for a second. I'll be right back. All right, this is pretty dry. I can go in and just add a few sharper edges here and there. Some quick dry brush strokes. Now, one thing I've done here, see how I've the darker tone on this side than on this side of that lamppost, and you really need to have some of about the same tone on either side, otherwise it looks a bit unfinished. So it's probably easier just to add some of this darker tone over here, just like that. Quick dry brush strokes, add a bit of light. Vary the colour. Now this area here needs to be a bit darker, so I'm going to just mix some French Ultramarine, a little bit of Permanent Rose, burnt Sienna, maybe some Cobalt Blue, just a small amount of the Cad Orange, just to mix a warm grey colour. Now, it's lighter in tone at the edge of the awning and gets darker as you move towards the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wet that area with paint. Clean my brush, or have another brush that's already clean handy, and I'll just soften that edge. That's good enough. Just scraping out some little highlights here. And I can now go in and paint the rest of this tree. Even these ones here, just to paint in their trunks and branches. Let's do the distant ones first. Make sure the tone is right, otherwise the branches and trunks will look disconnected from the trees. This line should have come down a bit more. All we're doing is adding some texture. Let's paint these figures. Just get some Scarlet Lake, raw umber, just for their flesh tones, and hair. And you can always go in and add some more detail later with some gouache too. Just a little hint of a shadow underneath them just to connect them to the ground. A bit of blue to that mix and put in some figures over in the distance. You're not going to see a lot of detail in them. It really just hints at figures. But just by lifting, we add a little bit of form to the figure, because this side of the figure would be capturing some of the reflected light. Okay, let's work on these cars now. Just hinting at this car having some red in it. Just soften that. It's good. This is not the final shadow, I'm just putting that in to remind me to do some work on the shadow. And you're not going to see a lot of detail of this car. Okay, now the tram. I need to let this dry a bit before I finish that tram off, so I use this as an opportunity to look at other parts of the painting. Just do some extra little detail. All right, let me go dry all this. Now, let's put in some of the bigger details. Lamp posts. When you're painting the lampposts, remember that as they move further away, they're going to become smaller and lighter in tone, and their various shapes have to appear to be approaching the vanishing point. So keep that in mind. Just add a bit of water just to dilute that. Tonally, I don't want it stronger in tone than this. I can always darken this one on the front. Just lifting some of the paint on the right hand side. I'm not as critical as with this one because it's further away. These lights will also get smaller as they move into the distance. They'll get lighter as well. The placement of the wheels is important, so keep an eye on that. The spacing between the front and the back wheels is not as great as people think unless the car is turning or driving across our line of sight. I'm now adjusting the tones of the cars. By darkening the back, it helps give a bit more form to the overall shape of the cars. The shadow underneath the cars will always be darker in tone than the cast shadow. So right now I'm just putting the shadow underneath the car. The same with the tram. The reason for that shadow to be so strong is because the shadow out here, for instance, will still get some light from the sky, but underneath the car, the body of the car blocks that light from going through. Here I'm just using a little bit of Scarlet Lake and Cad Orange for the taillights. I'm now going to paint the shadow cast by these objects, and these lampposts have a cast shadow down here too, but they're sort of soft edges, so I'll need to wet this part of the road to allow for that soft edge. Okay, let's mix a big puddle of shadow colour. I'll just start with French Ultramarine, a little bit of burnt sienna, even less of permanent rose. The closer a shadow is to an object, the sharper its edges will be. So in this case, the car is very close to this shadow and we're getting quite a sharp edge to the shadow. Later you'll see when I do the lamppost, because the shadow's further away, they have a much softer edge. So now I'm wetting this part of the painting so I can paint the shadow cast by the lamppost and the awning and create a soft edge shadow. Just going to break up that shadow there, just so it's not totally a sharp edge. When painting your shadows into the wet paper, use thicker paint or the marks will not be too well defined. And there's some shadow cast by the awning, that's why this area is a bit darker than out here. And the road has a bit more texture on it. I'm careful not to overdo these additional textural marks. Your finger can be a useful tool to adjust some of these edges. A bit messy, however. Here I'm just adding some extra little details to the windows. Make sure you don't totally outline the window's shape, however. What I'm going to do, go to the board, I need the paper to sit on it, starting to move around a bit too much as the paper has dried. So at this stage, all I need to do is just wet the board. And that moisture will hold the paper in place. There we go. I'm just using my cheap rigger brush for these power wires Try not to overdo them. You just want to add enough lines to break up an empty sky. Throw a few birds in the sky. With this painting, I just wanted to show you how you can capture the atmosphere and the feel of a location without feeling like you have to draw every tiny little detail. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so. It does help me out and it helps the channel out a lot. And if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon. See you for the next one.